my name is Katie Hatch, and this is my action research presentation on guided reading and its effects on kindergarten reading achievement. My research question was, in what ways does guided reading affect the reading achievement of kindergarten students? So reading is imperative to all teachers throughout all ages and disciplines. No matter what you're teaching, you are going to have to teach your children how to read. This study asks the questions, in what ways does guided reading affect the reading achievement of kindergarten students? For the study, multiple assessments were used on the 13 kindergarten students. So as an overview, guided reading is the main component of the literacy program at the school that this study took place. According to Fountas and Pinnell, guided reading is a small group instructional context in which a teacher supports each reader's development of systems of strategic actions for processing new texts at increasingly challenging levels of difficulty. Basically, what this is saying is that guided reading is done in small groups. Teachers are teaching readers how to read with different strategies, and they are working their way up to increasingly new texts that are more challenging and more difficult to read. So it's really important for this study to understand what guided reading is. So I'm going to get into what guided reading looks like for just a few minutes, and then we'll get back to the study itself. So before even touching guided reading, students are grouped by abilities. So this is usually done by a running record or by a benchmark or maybe a previous year's test or things like that. So their abilities are determined, the groups are created based on their abilities. Then, once the groups are made and the abilities are discussed, the books are analyzed that are actually going to be read with the students. So you'll get a book from the book run, that's where we get our books, and you look at the book and you look for a bunch of different things. You look for how many words are on a page. You look for the sight words that are there. You look for new vocabulary words. You look for how well the pictures support the text. You look for all of these things before picking a book. And then you select a book for a group based on what you learned in the book, based on what's in the book. And then you create a plan, and that will be discussed on the next slide. So, during guided reading, and this is all planned out ahead of time, but during guided reading, you give an introduction, and the introduction usually has a general storyline. It usually points out some tricky words, or it points out patterns that might be repetitive throughout. Usually you talk about character names and make predictions throughout an introduction. Then the students read a book, and while the students are reading, the teacher gives supports and prompts in order to help the student read. So those prompts usually come with how the student is already reading, which usually supports the teaching point, which we will get to. But you're going to prompt students to look at the word carefully, or you're going to look for students to check the picture, or you're going to look for students to make sense out of what they're reading in order to predict tricky words and anything like that. Then, when students are done reading, the book is discussed, and comprehension questions are given, and connections are made, and all that stuff that is done at the end of reading is really important, so students have an understanding and knowledge of what it's like to read a book, and what you need to look for, and what you need to understand. Then there's a teaching point, and the teaching point is what you want your students to get out of the reading that you just did. So you're going to pick something that they need to work on. For example, if a student wasn't reading to the end of a word, and they said the word look instead of looked, and then later on they said walk instead of walks, and then later on they said run instead of running. You're going to choose a teaching point. You're going to say, all right, we're going to learn how to read to the end of words today. And you will guide them through that kind of thing to teach them to read to the end of words as they're reading. Then you end the lesson with word work. And that can look like anything from practicing sight words to adding endings to words if you want to heighten your teaching point, if that was your teaching point. You can create words, talk about sentences, talk about flow, things like that you would do in your word work portion. While guided reading is happening, you only have 2 to 4 students at most. Sometimes there's 1. I only have groups of 2, sometimes there's 3, but I don't usually hit 4. That's usually older grades. But while I have small groups, the rest of the class is doing what's called workboard. Basically, they're just literacy centers that students are doing while guided reading is happening, and those help to boost reading achievement and scores and things like that, but it wasn't discussed in this study, so we're going to move on. So, this is a long quote, but I think it's really important. It says, "The advantage of early exposure to print can result in a more successful entry into formal reading, and thus a greater ability to desire to read. Children provided with this advantage often learn to read with greater ease than their less prepared peers. By developing strong decoding skills, they engage in more reading, which in turn exposes them to more print, enabling them to develop vocabularies and comprehension skills far beyond their peers that are not doing that. Their exposure to print through frequent reading creates a widening academic achievement gap." Basically what this is saying is that it's so important to get students into reading and into exposure to print and how you read from left to right and how pictures support the words and how there's spaces between words and that words are represented in print and one word in print is one word out loud, and that words are broken up by spaces and all those things that are very basic to reading. The sooner that you introduce kids to those, the more successful they will be in the future. That's what this quote is saying, and that's really important, which is why I think that we start guided reading in kindergarten to start these skills as early as we can. So Chipwood tells us that for 5-year-olds, learning is at its best when it is both structured and exploratory, and it's structured through clear and predictable schedule, and it's exploratory through carefully constructed interest areas where children can initiate their own activity. Basically, he's saying that it needs to be consistent and it needs to be fun. Basically is what he's saying. For the 6-year-old curriculum, he's saying that at 6, the child is extremely receptive to all new learning. Their eagerness, their curiosity, imagination, drive, and enthusiasm are perhaps never again matched in quantity or intensity during the lifespan. So basically he's saying 6-year-olds are sponges, and they're going to absorb lots of things, and they're excited to learn, and they want to learn, and you're never going to be as excited to learn as a 6-year-old is. That's what this quote is saying. Chipwood then goes on to say that a 5-year-old reading curriculum should include strengthening reading skills by reading predictable books, and that learning phonics should be done in small groups with children at similar skill levels. So, predictable books and grouped kids by skill, which is a lot of what guided reading is. As we move into 6-year-old curriculum, Chipwood tells us that we should continue doing phonics learning by doing guided reading with the whole class and in small groups. Then we want to continue reading predictable books while beginning to move into easy chapter books. And what's so important about this is that he mentions guided reading. So he's saying explicitly about 6-year-olds is that we should be doing guided reading. Not only in small groups, but as a whole class with a big book, and we're all talking about reading strategies together, and it's a conversation, and everybody gets to benefit at the same time. Along with the small groups, where we talk about individual kids' skills. They're both important here. Chipwood has an important quote that's going to come up later, so it's important for me to tell you now. He says about 5-year-olds that they reverse letters and numbers with increasing frequency and may find reading and writing activities extremely frustrating if not closely related to their interests. And just keep that in mind as we move forward into what the study showed after we were done. And he states that 6-year-olds' ability to track visually from left to right readies them for reading instruction. This is so important because what Chipwood is saying is that 6-year-olds are developmentally ready. Their eyes are ready, their brain is ready, their mentality is ready to track print from left to right, and that makes them ready for reading instruction. So, let me tell you what action research is. Action research is research conducted by the person who will benefit from the research. In this case, I was the one conducting, and the research benefited me. The components of action research are as follows. You choose a focus based on a problem. You collect data on the topic. You analyze the data. The data is reported and shared, and the most important step is that the data invokes change. So, I say this is the most important step because none of the rest of them matter if you don't change your practice when you're done. If you didn't learn something from your study, if you didn't come up with a new strategy or a new thought or a new activity, anything. If you cannot change at the end of your study, you did not do action research. For this study, the participants were 13 kindergarten students from a small rural town in southwestern Maine. They were, in the 13, there were 8 girls and 5 boys. I think it's also important to point out that the district that this was in has a literacy goal, and I'm going to read that to you. So it says that by 2016-2017, which is the year that this study was done, it says that the students will demonstrate their ability to read grade-level text proficiently and independently through instruction aligned to the district CCSS curriculum framework, driven with sound practices and formative assessments, resulting in at least 75% literacy proficiency across the grade levels based on FAST and STAR assessments. What it's saying is that with standardized assessments and benchmarking, we should have all of our students or 75% of our students rather, at their reading level for their grade. So for kindergartners, if you're doing Fountas and Pinnell, they should be reading at an independent C by the time that they leave kindergarten. These were the materials and procedures that I followed in order to do the guided reading action research. The first step that I needed to do was receive consent for the study. I needed consent first from the principal, and then I needed consent from the parents. And I got immediate approval from the principal, and when I sent it home to the parents, I ended up not getting one back. So I would have had 14 in my study, but without consent from one, I ended up with 13 students in my study. The second step that I did was I looked back at data that I already had. So I looked back at things that we had already done in the year. I looked at a journal entry, at a letter identification assessment, at a letter sound assessment, and at observation notes from guided reading groups. And I'll get more into those later. The third step was focusing on the data. So that was during the 6 weeks of the actual study, I focused on the data. I focused on what I could do to help the students make as much growth as they can from the original data to when the study was complete. So I focused on the data. Then the last step was to reassess. So I went back and I did the same assessments again to see if I could find any growth throughout the year. I think it's important to note that the first time I assessed was in the fall, and the second time that I assessed was in the spring. So there was a big gap well outside the 6-week period that I had for the action research. So what you see in the results is over a wider span of time than just 6 weeks. It was really over most of the year, like the middle portion of the year. This was the growth that we see. This is the journal assessment results. the orange shows you the first time I did it, so that is going to be the fall. And the gray shows you the second time that we did it, and that shows you the spring. As you can see in the fall, most kids, so 10 students, said that they liked to read. I forgot to tell you what this assessment looked like. Let me get back to that. So this assessment, I asked students to talk about how they feel about themselves as readers. I asked them to use the words, I do not like, I like, or I love reading. So I asked students to write about that in a sentence, and I asked them to draw a picture of their face, and if they were happy or sad or in the middle. When I did it in the fall, they had one line to write, and then when I did it in the spring, I gave the same prompt, but they had more lines to write because they had developed more in their writing curriculum. So, as you can see, most kids in the fall liked reading. 2 students did not like reading, and 1 student was totally off topic. When I assessed them on this, it was, she talked about flowers instead of reading. So that one is kind of null and void in this assessment. But in the spring, what we saw was a decrease in students who liked reading. So 6 students said that they liked reading. We gained students who said they loved reading. So we have now 3 students that say they love reading. We also went from 1 student to 2 students and do not like reading. So that also increased. And then we had a student, I had a student that said that they really don't like reading. So we'll get into what I think about this later. For the letter identification test, this was identical in the fall and the spring. So what we did was I sat students down, and I gave them, here we go. I sat them down one-on-one, and they were asked to name the uppercase letters off the sheet. So I gave them a sheet with uppercase letters, and then immediately followed that with lowercase letters. And I just asked them to name the letters, and that was it. So these are the results of that. As you can see, so again, the orange is the fall and the gray is the spring. You can see a huge shift from these numbers in the fall to these numbers in the spring. Most of the fall graph falls to the left and in the middle, and all of the spring graph falls in the right and to the middle. So the lowest that a student scored in the fall was 34 letters identified, and then in the spring, the lowest number that any student could identify was 48. So that went from 34 to 48, and then most students ended up identifying almost all of the letters. So 7 students identified all the letters, and we even had, 7 students identified 51 letters, so they missed 1, but we did have 2 students that were able to name all of the letters, which was amazing progress from before. So this is a closer look at the letter identification. So this shows you the fall uppercase letters, the ones that were missed, and the number of students, lowercase letters in the fall, spring uppercase letters, spring lowercase letters. Nothing stood out more than the fall uppercase letters than the fact that Y had 4 students miss that name, which was a lot because everything else had 1 or 2. So in the fall, Y was the hardest letter for students to identify. For the lowercase letters, there were a lot of students that missed some lowercase letters. The most prominent score is the lowercase q, and you can see that right here. And in the lowercase q, 12 students did not identify a lowercase q as q. So 12 out of 13 students could not identify a q as a q. The next most frequent was D and B. D, 6 students missed, and B, 4 students missed. And then in the spring, you can see that the graphs got significantly smaller because students did so much better in the spring than the fall. So there was nothing concerning in the spring uppercase letters, And the only thing that really stuck out in the spring lowercase letters was the letter Q again, and that had 9 students who missed the Q. So 9 out of 13 missed in the spring, and 12 out of 13 missed in the fall. This is the letter sound assessment. So for the letter sound assessment, it was completed the same in the fall and the spring. The students sat with me one-on-one and were asked to say the sounds that the letters made. And I want it to be noted that the students were looking at uppercase letters for this assessment because they were overall more successful in identifying uppercase letters. So, as you can see, another shift from the orange to the gray in the letter sound assessment from the fall to the spring. In the fall, the lowest number of letter sounds that a student could make was 19 sounds, and the most was 25. In the spring, the least amount of letter sounds that a student could make was 23, and the most was all 26. And then on the side here, you can see the sounds that were actually missed. In the fall, the ones that were missed the most were the letter E, so or E, and Q, so qu. Another one that was big was the letter Y, which is ya. In the spring, you can see that this graph got much smaller and there was many more students who were successful. So for this one, the letter that was hardest for students to say was E. And in both the fall and the spring, 6 students missed the letter E. So they were supposed to say or E. Either would have been accepted. But 6 students missed in the fall and the spring. For the sight word assessment, students sat with the teacher one-on-one and they read the sight words that they could read. So it was just the list right in front of them. They read as many sight words as they could. If they spent more than 2 seconds looking at a sight word, I just told them and they moved on. This shift is enormous. So as you see, the orange is very heavy to the left and the gray is very heavy to the right. There's really only one number that overlaps, and that was the highest that a student got in the fall with 19 words, and the lowest was 5. So in the fall, 2 students could only read 5 words, and 1 student could read 19. But in the spring, 1 student could read 18 words, so that was the least amount that any student got was 18, and the most that any student could read was all 25 words, which was great. That was a huge shift upward. For the observation notes. Now, the observation notes have a lot of stuff in them. These are informal notes that I take during guided reading lessons. So there's everything that we do in guided reading are in these notes. So the books that are read, the levels of the books, the date, any errors that the student missed, anything that the student was or wasn't doing that they should or should not have been, teaching points, word work, anything worth noting goes in these notes. So it was hard to choose one portion of the notes to look at, but I decided to go into the reading levels and how they tracked over the months. So down here you see the month and the reading level, and then up here you see the number of students that were in those reading levels. So what it's telling you is that in November, 8 students were reading level A book, and 5 students were reading level B at the end of November. At the end of December, 10 students were reading at a level B, and 3 students were reading at a level C. At the end of January, it was the same results as December, so 10 and 3. And then by the end of February, all 13 students were reading at a level C. So when I looked at the observation notes and I was looking at everything about the books and everything that I could see about the reading levels and the books and the students, and I did not see a direct correlation between the number of books read and the reading level that students were reading. So some students moved from an A to a B reading level after 2 books, and some took 3. And that wasn't a very big difference, 2 or 3 books. But when students were going from level B to C, there was a much bigger difference. One student went from B to C after just 2 books. 2 students moved after 3 books. 3 students moved after 9 books. And another 3 students moved after 10. And then 4 students, it took 11 books before they moved. So the gap there, the lowest number was 2 and the highest number was 11. So some students moved after 3 books and some after 11. And that was a very big difference. That's a lot of books, that's a lot of weeks, that's a lot of time spent in guided reading. So I did not see a correlation between the number of books read and the reading level. They just didn't line up. What I noticed when I was looking at the letter name assessment, I noticed that the letter Q was really hard for students to identify. And in looking at the assessment, this is what the Q looked like. However, when we teach how to write the letter Q, we always teach students that it's a circle with a line down and a tail. So, students know that Q has a tail. And the way that this is typed and printed, it does not have a tail. Many students called this letter a P because a Q is a backwards P. So that was really tricky for kids, and I think that that was the assessment's problem. You know, that wasn't the students. It could have been maybe Q is tough even with a tail. However, I wonder how different it would have been if that Q had a tail, if that still would have been as tricky for those kids to identify. When I looked at the journal assessments, I thought really hard about why so many students disliked reading at the end of the study. So at the end of the study, 4 students either really disliked reading or just disliked it. And that made me pretty sad because I work really hard to try to make reading fun and to try to make reading enjoyable and to instill a sense of love for reading because reading is so important and so much fun. And I remembered a quote from Chip Wood from earlier, if you remember. He said that 5-year-olds may find reading and writing activities extremely frustrating if not closely related to their interests. This is what I thought about when I saw this and thought to myself, if the books that they're reading at home are interesting enough for them to want to read the books. That's what I thought about when I saw that so many kids disliked it. Maybe they don't like the books that I pick for them because I ultimately pick the books that we read in guided reading and they take those home and they read them to their parents and then we read them every day at school. And if they don't like the books that they're reading, then they're not going to like reading. But another thing that I thought about when I was thinking really hard about these journal assessments is that previous to kindergarten, students were always being read to. It was rare for students to read a book to their parents, and if they could read a word, it was amazing and so exciting, and it was wonderful, and it was challenging, and now they're the ones that have to be reading. So now they have to think about what the words say. They have to think about what's happening in the book. They have to tell their parents what it says instead of the other way around. And I think that this shift in roles might be difficult for some students because the books that their parents read to them are so much fun and they have all these words and all these things that the students themselves could never read. Not never, but not in kindergarten. They can't read them yet. So the books that their parents read to them are way more fun. And at first, so when we first did the journal assessment, they had just started reading. So they were so excited that they could read any book at all. But I think by the end of the assessment, it kind of became a routine and students weren't liking it as much anymore. And so I'm going to think long and hard about that moving forward. When I looked at the letter name and letter sound assessment, I previously would have expected that if students can't name a letter, they won't be able to say the sound of the letter. But I was totally wrong. It really was pretty rare first student to miss the letter name and the letter sound. In the fall, only 5 students could not name both, and in the spring, only 1 student missed the letter name and the letter sound. So what I expected really was not true at all. That naming a letter and being able to make the sound that that letter makes really are 2 very different skills, and I thought that they were very intertwined. So I think it's important to make sure that both are being taught explicitly so that one isn't skewed in a direction that another one is not. When I looked at the sight word assessment, I couldn't see a correlation between the words that I had explicitly taught and the words that the students knew. So in the fall, I had taught 5 sight words to the kids. Those sight words were... Oh, I thought I had them listed. I must not. Anyway, I taught 5 words to the students, and almost none of those students could actually read all 5 of the sight words that I had taught. In the spring, I remember that I had taught 20 sight words in the spring, so there was only 5 words that I did not teach. And in the spring, the only students that got all of the sight words I had taught were the 2 students that had gotten all the sight words anyway. So I didn't see a connection between the words that I was teaching and the words that students were reading. And I think that it's just important to think that words that are taught with meaning are much more stuck in kids' heads. So when you drill a kid with words, it's not necessarily going to stick. But if they can use meaning and context and the understanding of the words that they know, they're more likely to be able to read those words. There were limitations to this study. And I think these go back to those things that I was wondering earlier, about how much is being read at home and how much is being done outside of the classroom that could be impacting these results. Intervention was a huge limitation of the study. So throughout the study, 9 of my 13 students had been in intervention at one point or another. Some students were still in it at the end of the study, some students started and got dropped, some students didn't start and ended in intervention, but 9 out of 13 students had been in an intervention group, so they were getting double literacy at one point in the year. And I think that could have had a huge impact on how their reading was, but the study was limited and did not include those in the study. Also, I was wondering how reading at home could affect these students, and I think that goes back to that quote from the beginning of the slideshow that talked about how early exposure to print can make students more successful readers. So I wonder how many of those students that took 11 books before they moved from a B to a C, and that took 9 books to move from a B to a C, I wonder how many of those students had that early exposure to print, or if those students came in and kindergarten was really their first experience with reading and literacy and print and understanding that words are print on a page. So that was something that this study could not track. What I found most important from this study is that all of the students made gains in their reading level, their letter sounds, their letter names, and their sight word recognition from the fall to the spring. Every single student made gains. Sometimes a student could have stayed the same on one assessment, but overall, all the students made gains. All the students went up from reading an A to a C, so all students gained those 3 reading levels. And that's really important. Guided reading helped them to become more successful readers. What I would recommend if this study was done again in the future is to ask the students why they feel the way that they feel about reading. So what I asked was just for them to tell me how they feel. But when I was looking at them, I didn't ask them why. So I don't know why those students did or didn't like reading, or why the student loves reading and the student doesn't like reading, and what the difference is, and I have no idea. I have no idea why they did or didn't like it. And I think that if this study was done again, that would be something really important to include, so you have more of an insight on why the kids are thinking what they're thinking. Also, if I could do this again, I would have collected data from the interventionists. I would have looked at the guided reading that they were doing in addition to the guided reading that I was doing, to see if that had more of an impact on the students that were in intervention and the students that were not. That would have been nice to see. In conclusion, guided reading had a positive impact on kindergarten reading achievement. These are my references, and thank you so much for listening.